The morning sun crept gently through the arched windows of the Providence Municipal Court, pouring thin rays of gold across the polished wooden benches. The faint scent of old paper and cedar filled the air, a quiet reminder of the countless stories of right and wrong that had unfolded within these walls. The courtroom was calm, yet there was a subtle tension in the air, the kind that whispers that something unforgettable is about to happen. In the front row, people murmured softly, exchanging glances toward the door. They had heard the rumors. The son of Senator Victor Marino would appear before Judge Frank Caprio today. The name alone carried weight in the city, attached to privilege, power, and influence. But inside this courtroom, none of that mattered. Here, justice didn't bow to power, it waited for truth. The heavy wooden door opened with a confident push. Ethan Marino entered as if the room belonged to him. Early 20s, perfectly styled hair, tailored navy blue suit that gleamed with expense. Every detail screamed entitlement. A smirk danced on his lips, the kind that comes from a life without consequences. His eyes scanned the room with detached amusement, as though he were arriving at a private club rather than a courtroom. Behind him, a few reporters scribbled in notebooks, sensing a story worth printing. The flash of a phone camera reflected briefly off Ethan's watch, a limited edition piece worth more than most people's yearly income. He adjusted his cufflinks and whispered something to his friend, drawing a quiet laugh. It wasn't the laughter of joy. It was arrogance disguised as confidence. The clerk called his name. Ethan sauntered forward, his shoes echoing sharply against the wooden floor. He stood before the empty judge's bench, arms loosely folded, body language dripping with nonchalance. Moments later, a door on the side creaked open, and Judge Caprio entered. Composed, dignified, carrying the weight of wisdom that years of justice had etched upon his face. His black robe moved softly with each step, and his calm gaze swept across the room. The audience rose out of respect, but Ethan only half-heartedly lifted his chin, hands still in his pockets. Judge Caprio settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses. The gavel rested quietly beside his hand, untouched, but heavy with presence. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence commanded the room. As the bailiff began the formalities, Ethan's smirk widened. He whispered to himself, barely concealing a grin, as though this entire process were beneath him. The case file before the judge listed multiple offenses: reckless driving, verbal assault on an officer, and public disturbance. Yet Ethan looked untouched by shame. Judge Caprio's calm eyes studied the young man before him, not with anger, but with understanding. He had seen arrogance before. He knew that behind every entitled smile was often a hollow space waiting to be filled with humility. Outside the courthouse, cars passed by in steady rhythm. Sirens faint in the distance, the sound of real lives moving under real consequences. Inside, however, time seemed to slow. The air thickened with anticipation. A faint beam of sunlight fell directly upon Ethan's face, as if nature itself wished to spotlight the irony. A boy who had inherited power without earning respect. Across from him, Judge Caprio sat in quiet dignity, the embodiment of earned authority. Ethan glanced around, unimpressed. He noticed the older citizens waiting for their hearings, the working-class faces, the nervous defendants clutching small envelopes of fines and citations. He felt different, above them, untouchable. He believed the rules that bound others did not apply to him, but beneath that arrogance was something else, a fragile uncertainty he didn't yet recognize. Years of being shielded by his father's status had built him walls so high that empathy could no longer reach him. And yet, within this quiet courtroom, those walls were about to crack. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, eyes steady. No words yet, only silence, but the kind of silence that speaks louder than reprimand. Ethan shifted slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face for the first time. The calm before the storm had arrived. The courtroom held its breath, balanced on the thin edge between privilege and principle. Soon words would be spoken that would echo longer than any punishment. And as the gavel rested silently beside the judge's hand, one truth was already certain. Arrogance had just met justice, and the lesson was about to begin, pulse echoing through the still air. Judge Caprio adjusted his spectacles, eyes resting on the file before him, while the murmurs of anticipation grew behind the wooden rail. The silence that had blanketed the room moments ago now trembled with the promise of conflict. Ethan Marino stood with his chin high, posture careless yet calculated. His father's shadow loomed large over the city, and he knew it. To him, this was not a courtroom, it was a stage. The audience was his to entertain, the system his to mock. He brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve, a faint smile creeping across his lips. As the charges were read aloud, Ethan barely listened. Words like reckless endangerment and public insult drifted around him like meaningless air. He rolled his eyes, crossing his arms, as though the proceedings were an inconvenience to his otherwise glamorous life. The reporters' pens scratched eagerly against their pads. Every flicker of his arrogance became a headline in the making. A low whisper rippled through the courtroom when Ethan let out a short laugh, a hollow, defiant sound that seemed to mock not only the process, but the very idea of accountability. Heads turned. The bailiff stiffened, glancing at the bench. But Judge Caprio remained still, unbothered, his calm composure forming an invisible shield of authority that no mockery could pierce. The young man tilted his head slightly, his expression daring, his eyes scanning the room as if to measure how much power his father's name still commanded. He could feel it, the silent fear, the hesitations, the subtle shift in people's posture. Power was intoxicating, and Ethan was drunk on it. But the man seated behind the bench did not flinch. Judge Caprio's gaze lifted, slow and deliberate, meeting Ethan's eyes with the calm weight of truth. That single look carried the authority of decades of justice, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. For the first time, Ethan's smirk faltered, just slightly, before he straightened his shoulders again in defiance. The clerk continued reading details of the incident. The speeding car, the red light ignored, the officer cursed at and threatened. Every word chipped at the image Ethan had built around himself. Yet instead of remorse, he found humor. He tapped his foot impatiently, glancing toward the press, almost as if performing for them. The audience exchanged uneasy looks. Some shook their heads, whispering about how far arrogance can blind a person. Even those who once admired his father's political legacy now felt a strange discomfort watching his son unravel before the scales of justice. And still, Judge Caprio did not speak. His silence was not weakness, it was restraint, a measured calm that amplified the gravity of the moment. He allowed the young man's pride to echo across the courtroom, to fill the space so completely that when truth arrived, it would land like thunder in the stillness. Ethan, frustrated by the lack of reaction, shifted tactics. He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharp and confident, as if daring the world to challenge him. His every movement reeked of inherited arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable. He believed his father's power shielded him like armor. But that illusion began to waver when Judge Caprio finally moved his hand. A simple gesture toward the file before him. The sound of paper turning echoed like the slow drumbeat of an oncoming storm. His calm eyes lifted once more, steady, unreadable. Ethan's grin faded. Something unspoken hung in the air. A tension that words couldn't explain. It was as if the young man's arrogance had finally met a force it couldn't intimidate. The courtroom, once buzzing with murmurs, fell completely silent. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. The stillness of truth, the authority of conscience, the presence of a man who represented something no power could buy. Integrity. His shoulders stiffened. His throat tightened. The smirk was gone. The storm had arrived, not in raised voices or angry judgment, but in quiet strength. Judge Caprio's silence spoke volumes, and Ethan realized too late that he was no longer in control of the room. As the sound of the gavel finally broke the silence, the echoes filled every corner of the courtroom. It wasn't a sound of punishment. It was the sound of truth reclaiming its ground. Outside, clouds began to gather, dimming the light that had once poured through the windows. Inside, the atmosphere shifted completely. Arrogance had met resistance, and the balance of power had begun to tilt. The battle lines were drawn, pride on one side, principle on the other. And though Ethan didn't yet know it, this confrontation wasn't about law or punishment. It was about transformation. The clash had begun. The storm had passed its loudest point. What remained was silence, a silence that felt heavier than words, resting across the courtroom like a moral weight no one dared disturb. Ethan Marino stood still, his earlier arrogance now softened into confusion. He couldn't quite understand why the judge hadn't scolded him, shouted at him, or demanded an apology. The absence of rage felt more unsettling than anger itself. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes lingering on the young man before him. There was no judgment in those eyes, only a calm, knowing patience, the kind that comes from having seen the same mistakes repeat through generations of men who thought power could outshine character. His demeanor radiated quiet strength. It was as though the entire courtroom had shifted its gravity toward him. The audience waited, barely breathing. Reporters paused their pens mid-sentence. Even the bailiff, standing firm near the bench, seemed to sense that something profound was about to unfold. The judge's gaze moved from Ethan's polished shoes to his proud posture, and finally to his eyes. Eyes that had known privilege but not perspective. And for the first time, Ethan couldn't hold the stare. Something inside him stirred, faint but real, a whisper of discomfort that came from being seen for who he truly was. Judge Caprio opened the case file once more, glancing briefly at the list of offenses. Reckless driving, endangerment, verbal abuse of an officer. The words looked simple on paper, but behind them were lives, people who could have been hurt, rules that could have been broken beyond repair. Yet instead of condemning, he reflected, justice wasn't about crushing the guilty, it was about giving them a mirror. In that quiet courtroom, Caprio began to do just that. His words, calm and steady, carried the tone of a teacher, not an accuser. He spoke of legacy, how a man's name was not built by what he inherited, but by what he earned. He spoke of fathers and sons, of respect and humility, of how true strength came not from power, but from restraint. As his voice filled the space, something invisible shifted in the air. Even the walls seemed to listen. Every word landed like a soft hammer upon Ethan's pride, chipping away at the armor he had worn for years. Images flooded Ethan's mind. His father's influence, the bodyguards, the endless praise, the quiet corruption disguised as success. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had never achieved anything by himself. Every victory had been borrowed, every shield paid for by his father's power. Judge Caprio paused for a moment, giving the silence its due weight. He then turned the page in the file and spoke again, this time with warmth. He spoke about second chances, about how the law could punish, but only compassion could change a person. About how mistakes were not the end of a story, but sometimes the painful beginning of a better one. The courtroom remained utterly still. Ethan's chest rose and fell unevenly. He wasn't used to feeling small, and yet in that moment, he didn't feel belittled. He felt seen. It was a feeling that frightened and comforted him at the same time. Then came the verdict, not with the thunder of punishment, but with the grace of mercy. The fine was minimal, almost symbolic, but attached to it was something far heavier, a sentence of community service at a youth rehabilitation center. A murmur rippled through the room, not of disapproval, but of respect. Judge Caprio hadn't humiliated the boy. He had given him a path, a choice between staying who he was and discovering who he could become. The gavel came down softly, a sound more like closure than command. Ethan stood still, trying to understand what had just happened. No anger, no harshness, only dignity. It was the first time in his life that authority had been used not to dominate him, but to lift him toward understanding. As the judge rose from his seat, the crowd instinctively stood with him. Ethan, uncertain, hesitated, and then, slowly, followed. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. The first hint of respect born not of fear, but of realization. The courtroom emptied, leaving Ethan alone for a brief moment, staring at the spot where Judge Caprio had stood. The man hadn't shouted. He hadn't condemned. And yet his presence lingered like sunlight after a storm, warm, patient, and quietly transformative. For the first time, Ethan Marino felt the weight of true justice. Not the kind written in law books, but the kind that rewrites a soul. The sun hung low over the city skyline, painting the courthouse steps in long, golden streaks. For the first time in his life, Ethan Marino wasn't being driven away in a black car with tinted windows. He walked alone. No chauffeur, no entitlement, no flashing smiles from people pretending to respect him. Just the sound of his own footsteps echoing against the stone pavement, steady and uncertain. His father's name had once felt like armor. Now it felt like a weight. Every time someone looked at him, he could sense the judgment. That's the politician's son, the one who mocked the judge. The headlines had spread fast, but so had the video of Judge Caprio's calm, powerful verdict. It wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a lesson. A week later, Ethan reported to the Youth Rehabilitation Center, a small, worn-down building at the edge of the city. The walls were faded, the benches old, the smell of paint and cleaning supplies lingering in the air. He had expected to hate it, but what he found inside caught him off guard. Children, teenagers, some no older than 16, each one carrying a story far heavier than his own. Some had lost their parents, others had lost themselves. And yet in their eyes he saw something that startled him. Hope. Fragile, flickering hope. He was assigned to help clean the classrooms, repaint the walls, and assist with tutoring. The first few days were awkward. The staff looked at him with quiet suspicion, assuming he wouldn't last. The kids ignored him. He was just another privileged outsider doing community service for appearances. But something changed on the fourth day. He watched a young boy struggle to read a simple sentence. The boy stuttered, hesitated, almost gave up, until one of the volunteers gently placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him through it. Ethan felt something stir deep inside him. He didn't understand it then, but it was empathy, a feeling he had long forgotten he was capable of. Slowly he began to show up early, stay late. He painted the peeling walls, fixed broken chairs, and started to listen to the stories of the kids around him. One evening, a teenage girl told him she wanted to become a lawyer, to help people who don't have rich fathers. Her words cut deep. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Judge Caprio had said, about legacy, humility, and earning one's name. Weeks turned into months. The arrogance that once clung to him began to fade, replaced by quiet purpose. He no longer wore designer suits or flashed his family's wealth. Instead, he wore simple clothes, rolled up his sleeves, and worked. For the first time, his reflection didn't look like a stranger. One afternoon, the center's director approached him. She handed him a stack of papers, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth, newly funded. At the bottom of the page, in neat printed letters, it read, Marino Foundation for Hope. His father had made the donation anonymously. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Perhaps the old man had been watching all along, silently proud of the son who was finally learning to stand on his own. When Ethan left the center that day, the sky was burning with sunset light. He looked back at the building, the chipped walls, the kids playing in the yard, the laughter that echoed in the halls. It wasn't just a place of punishment anymore. It had become the birthplace of his redemption. In that moment, Ethan made a silent promise. He would not let this transformation fade. He would rebuild his name, not through privilege, but through service, through integrity, through compassion. Far away in his quiet office, Judge Caprio received a letter, handwritten, humble, and heartfelt. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply said, thank you. And when Caprio finished reading it, he smiled. The kind of smile that came from seeing justice not just done, but understood. The courtroom was silent now. The same room that once echoed with arrogance and entitlement stood still, bathed in the gentle morning light filtering through tall windows. Judge Caprio sat behind his bench, not as a man of authority, but as a man deep in thought. The gavel rested beside him, untouched. Papers lay neatly stacked, the faint hum of the city outside breaking the stillness. On his desk lay an envelope, unassuming, yet heavy with emotion. It was the letter from Ethan Marino. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places, but the words carried weight beyond measure. Caprio had read it twice already, once as a judge, the second time as a man. Ethan had written about his months at the rehabilitation center, how he'd seen a side of life he never knew existed. How he'd met children who smiled through pain and volunteers who gave without asking, and how in their eyes he had finally seen himself, not as a politician's son, but as a man with purpose. Whisper, "You didn't punish me, Your Honor. You saved me." Caprio leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening behind the glasses. To the world, justice was about verdicts and sentences, but to him it was always about something deeper, the chance to awaken humanity in those who'd lost it. He believed that true justice wasn't about breaking a person down, it was about helping them rise again. He turned his gaze toward the empty seats in the courtroom, remembering the day Ethan had stood there, chin high, smirk unshaken, drunk on privilege. And then he remembered the quiet silence that had filled the room when the verdict was delivered. A silence not of victory, but of understanding. He had seen that silence before, in veterans, in single mothers, in struggling fathers, in the broken and the proud alike. The silence that follows when a soul begins to listen to itself. Caprio reached for his small notebook, a habit he'd carried for years. Inside were hundreds of scribbled reflections, lessons he'd learned from the countless faces that had stood before his bench. He flipped to a fresh page and began to write. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moment when a heart decides to change. The true measure of a man isn't how he handles power, but how he responds when it's taken away. And every soul, no matter how lost, deserves a chance to find its way home. He paused, setting the pen down. The morning light had shifted, painting warm gold across the wood of his desk. Outside, the sound of church bells drifted faintly through the window. Soft, distant, comforting. Caprio smiled to himself. Not the smile of pride, but of peace. He had spent decades in that courtroom, watching anger, arrogance, and pain unfold before him. Yet every now and then, he witnessed something rare, transformation. And it was in those moments that he knew his purpose was being fulfilled. He rose slowly, adjusting his robe, and walked to the window. The city stretched before him, alive, imperfect, but full of second chances. Somewhere out there, a young man named Ethan Marino was walking a new path. And that, Caprio thought, was all the justice the world truly needed. As the scene faded, the camera would linger on Judge Caprio's thoughtful face, framed by the morning light, his eyes distant yet kind. A final narration would echo softly over the image. In every courtroom, there's more than law. There's life. And sometimes justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins with forgiveness. The gavel came down one last time, not to deliver judgment, but to close a story of redemption, compassion, and the power of change. And as the screen slowly faded to black, the words appeared. Justice isn't just served, it's shared.